Ilara existed in the spaces between. For 2 years, the walls of the Alpha King's castle had been her world, a labyrinth of forgotten passages and dusty crawl spaces meant for servants long dead. She was a ghost in a machine of granite and gold, a secret kept by the mice and the drafts. Her life was measured in stolen crusts of bread and the muffled sounds of a world that had forgotten her. She learned the castle's rhythms like her own heartbeat. The clatter of pans from the kitchens in the morning, the sonorous drone of the royal council in the afternoon, and the distant, haunting melodies of the court musicians at night. She was a creature of dust and silence, her existence a fragile thread woven into the tapestry of a kingdom that would have crushed her if it ever knew she was there. This life, this shadow existence, was a desperate choice. After her parents were branded as traitors and executed, their lands seized and their name erased, Ilara had nowhere to go. She had slipped into the castle during a festival, a slip of a girl with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terror so profound it had hollowed out her soul. She found the old passages by accident, a loose stone panel behind a tapestry, and had stepped through it into a different kind of prison. It was a prison that offered survival, but at the cost of living. She was safe, but she was also nothing. Today, the cold was a physical thing, a predator gnawing at the thin fabric of her worn dress. She was huddled in her favorite listening spot, a narrow gap behind the great throne itself, where a decorative screen of carved obsidian offered a sliver of a view into the throne room. It was here she felt the pulse of the kingdom most acutely. Today, that pulse was venomous. Lord Valerius was speaking, his voice a silken poison that slithered through the air and coiled in her stomach. "With filth, your majesty." "Valerius, with filth." "Your majesty," Valerius declared, his words echoing in the cavernous chamber. "Refugees, beggars, orphans, vermin, they breed dissent and disease. A kingdom must be kept clean. We must purge the shadows, sweep out the dark corners, both in the capital and within these very walls. One never knows what sort of pests might take root if we are not vigilant." Ilara flinched, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. Vermin. Pests. He was talking about people. People like her. She had seen the desperation in the city's lower quarters from high, forgotten windows. She knew the hollow-eyed hunger he dismissed with such casual cruelty. His words were not just policy, they were a judgment on her very existence. If he knew a pest was breathing the same air as him, separated by only a few feet of stone and wood, he would have the guards tear the wall down with their bare hands. The thought sent a tremor of pure, undiluted fear through her. She risked a glance through the crack. Lord Valerius stood tall and proud, his silver hair immaculate, his robes of deep crimson a splash of blood against the stone floor. He was the perfect courtier, his every gesture a study in controlled arrogance. But Ilara saw the rot beneath the polish. She had watched him for 2 years, had heard the whispers and the veiled threats he deployed like weapons. He was a man who believed power was a right of birth, and that those born without it were less than human. Her stomach growled, a pathetic, traitorous sound in the suffocating silence of her hiding place. It was a constant companion, this gnawing emptiness. The last of her stolen bread, a heel of rye meant for the hounds, was gone yesterday. Hunger made her weak, made her careless. She pressed a hand to her belly, willing it to be quiet, her focus entirely on the scene beyond the wall. She had to know what the king would say. The throne was empty. King Kale was not present for this morning's audience, which was why Valerius felt so free to spew his poison. The king's absence was a void that lesser men rushed to fill with their own ambitions. Ilara had never seen the Alpha King up close, not truly. She had seen him from a distance, a formidable figure moving through the halls, a whirlwind of guards and sycophants in his wake. He was more legend than man, a king who had taken the throne at a young age after the brutal wars and had ruled with a fist of iron and an unnerving silence ever since. They called him the Wolf King, the Silent Alpha. They said his eyes could see into a man's soul and find the lies hidden there. Ilara didn't believe in legends. She believed in the cold stone at her back, the dust motes dancing in the single sliver of light, and the sharp, painful reality of her own survival. She was a realist born of tragedy. And the reality was that men like Valerius were dangerous, and kings were too distant to care about the whispers of a girl who lived in their walls. He would likely agree to the purge. It was practical. It was what kings did. They kept their kingdoms clean. The thought settled like a shroud over her, another layer of despair on a spirit already burdened with so much. She was vermin, and the exterminator was making his case. Suddenly, the great doors of the throne room boomed open, the sound so loud it was a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the assembled courtiers. The guards snapped to attention, their pikes striking the marble floor in a unified, deafening crack. A hush fell, so absolute and immediate it was as if all the air had been sucked from the room. No jewels, no excessive finery. His only? No jewels, no excessive finery. His only adornment was a circlet of unadorned blackened steel that rested on a mane of night-dark hair. He moved with a predatory grace that made every other person in the room seem clumsy and insubstantial. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the floor. No one dared to meet his gaze. Ilara felt a new kind of fear, entirely different from the one Valerius inspired. This was not the fear of a bully's cruelty. This was the primal, instinctual terror of a mouse finding itself in the presence of a wolf. His power was a tangible force, an oppressive weight that settled over the room, silencing every breath, stilling every heart. He walked to the dais but did not sit on the throne. Vantage point. She could see the hard-line vantage point. She could see the hard line of his jaw, the tense set of his shoulders. He radiated an aura of profound weariness, a deep, abiding exhaustion with the world he commanded. It was a strange detail to notice, but it was as clear as the raw power he projected. He was a lonely, tired predator. His gaze swept across the sea of bowed heads. It was a slow, deliberate inspection, and Ilara felt a vicarious dread for the courtiers trapped in its path. She watched as his eyes, which she could not yet see the color of, moved past Lord Valerius without a flicker of acknowledgement. He ignored the fawning nobles, the ambitious ministers, the bejeweled ladies. His gaze continued its relentless sweep, past the guards, past the towering pillars, past the ancient tapestries, and then it stopped. It stopped on the decorative screen directly in front of her. It stopped on the sliver of darkness where she was hidden. Ilara's heart ceased to beat. It was impossible. He could not see her. There was nothing to see. It was a trick of the light, a coincidence. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will herself into non-existence, to become nothing more than dust and shadow. But she could feel it. She could feel his attention like a physical touch, a searing heat that burned through the stone and wood and fabric separating them. It was a gaze that did not just look, but saw. Her breath hitched, a tiny, wretched sound she was sure he could hear across the echoing silence of the room. She held perfectly still, her muscles screaming in protest. The silence stretched, becoming thin and brittle. The entire court waited, oblivious, holding its breath for his judgment on Valerius's proposal. But the king was not looking at Valerius. He was looking at the wall. He was looking at her. Finally, after an eternity that lasted only a few seconds, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the hall, a low, rumbling timbre that vibrated in Alara's bones. It was the sound of gravel and ice. "The council is dismissed," he said. Just that. No ruling, no comment. Only a flat, indisputable command. There was a moment of confused shuffling, then a rustle of silk and a scraping of chairs as the courtiers scrambled to obey. Lord Valerius looked momentarily stunned, his mouth half open, but a single, sharp glance from the king sent him scurrying away with the others. Within moments, the vast throne room was empty. The great doors boomed shut, leaving only the king, the silent guards flanking the entrance, and the unseen girl behind the throne. Alara's world had shrunk to the space of a breath. He knew. He had to know. She was caught. The 2 years of careful, silent survival were over. Her frantic mind raced, picturing her fate. Would they drag her out and throw her in the dungeons? Execute her on the spot for trespassing in the heart of the royal sanctum? Her parents were traitors. What mercy would their daughter receive? Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She heard his footsteps on the marble, slow and deliberate. Not moving away, towards the doors, but moving closer. Closer to the throne, closer to her. Each footfall was a hammer blow against her sanity. She flattened herself against the cold stone, trying to melt into it. She could hear the soft sound of his breathing now. He was right on the other side of the screen. She expected him to call for the guards, to roar in anger. Instead, there was only silence. A heavy, expectant silence that was somehow worse than any rage. And then, the impossible happened. A strange, inexplicable sensation bloomed in her chest. It was not fear. It was a pull, a gentle but insistent tug, as if an invisible thread had spooled out from her soul and connected to something on the other side of the wall. It was a warmth that spread through her limbs, chasing away the gnawing chill for the first time in years. It felt like recognition, a bizarre and terrifying sense of coming home. The bond, though she did not know its name, flared to life in the space between them. It was a mystical, ancient magic, a connection that chemistry could not explain and logic could not deny. It hummed in the air, a silent song only their two souls could hear. It was a resonance, a feeling of finding a part of herself she never knew was missing. His voice came again, softer this time, a low murmur meant only for the wall, meant only for her. "I know you are there." A gasp escaped her lips, small and sharp. It was true. Her worst fear realized. She was discovered. But the voice? It held no anger. It held a quiet, questioning gravity. The warmth in her chest intensified, battling with the icy terror in her veins. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a strange mix of command and reassurance. "But you cannot stay in there." Alara remained frozen, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and fear. Was this a trick? A way to lure the vermin out of its hole before the snap of the trap? She couldn't trust him. He was a king. He was the son of the man who had ordered her parents' deaths. And yet, the pull in her chest was undeniable, a silent testament that contradicted all her fear-soaked logic. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was so simple, so direct, it cut through her panic. Her name. It had been 2 years since anyone had said her name aloud. She had almost forgotten the shape of it on her own tongue. To be a ghost was to be nameless. To answer was to become real again. And to be real was to be vulnerable. She could stay silent. He would order the guards to tear the wall down eventually, flickered in the darkness of her fear. She could take the smallest, most terrifying step back into the world of the living. A spark of the defiance that had kept her alive for so long flickered in the darkness of her fear. She had survived this long. She would not be dragged out like a rat. She would walk out. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, raspy thing, cracked from disuse. Alara. She heard him take a slow, deep breath. The sound was oddly intimate in the vast, empty room. Ilara, he repeated, and the way he said it was different. It was not a question, but a statement. A recognition. As if he had been waiting to hear it his entire life. The invisible thread between them tightened, humming with a sudden, fierce energy. "Come out, Alara," he said, and it was not a command. It was an invitation. That night, the grand hall was a galaxy of shimmering silk and glittering jewels. 1,000 candles burned in golden chandeliers, their light glinting off polished marble and the polished smiles of the kingdom's elite. Alara watched from a high, shadowed alcove, a place she had used before to observe the court's festivities. But tonight was different. She was not just a hungry ghost watching a feast. She was a girl with a name, a girl who had been seen by a king. After their strange, disembodied conversation, he had simply walked away. He had not called the guards. He had not forced her out. He had left her with an invitation and a choice. It was the first choice she had been given in 2 years, and it terrified her more than any command would have. She had remained in her hiding place, her heart hammering, the warmth of that strange connection still buzzing under her skin, until the sun had set and the sounds of the evening banquet began to drift up from below. Now she watched him. Court. His storm-gray eyes missing court. His storm-gray eyes missing nothing. Alara saw the way the nobles vied for his attention, the way the ladies postured and preened. It was a performance, a grand, elaborate play, and he was the unwilling audience. The weariness she had seen earlier was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes. He was a king drowning in a sea of insincerity. Lord Valerius was in his element, moving through the crowd with the predatory ease of a shark. He stopped at the king's table, bowing low. Ilara was too far away to hear his words, but she saw the oily smile, the ingratiating posture. The king listened, his expression unreadable, and then gave a curt, dismissive nod. Valerius's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before he recovered, bowing again and melting back into the crowd. He was a poison that the king was forced to tolerate. The banquet droned on, a symphony of clinking silver and false laughter. Alara's stomach ached with a hunger so intense it was dizzying. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine was a form of exquisite torture. She was about to retreat back into the darkness of the passages, convinced the king had forgotten her, that it had all been some strange fever dream, when he stood. Instantly, a hush fell over the hall. Every eye turned to him. He lifted a hand, not for silence, but simply as a gesture to hold their attention. He did not need to ask for it. He commanded it by his very existence. For too long, he began, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the vast room. This court has concerned itself with bloodlines and dowries, with alliances of convenience and matches of political gain. A confused murmur rippled through the assembly. They had expected a toast, a political announcement, not a lecture. These traditions have made the heart of this kingdom brittle, he continued, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the most powerful families in the realm. They have placed value on land and titles, and forgotten the value of the spirit, of strength, of resilience. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Alara leaned forward, her breath held captive in her lungs. What was he doing? "I have decided to take a consort," he announced. The hall erupted. A wave of gasps, excited whispers, and frantic glances washed over the room. The great families, the ones with eligible daughters, were practically vibrating with anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for, scheming for years. This was the ultimate prize. The king let the chaos build for a moment before raising his hand again. Silence fell once more, sharp and absolute. "But she will not be chosen from among you," he said, his voice dropping, becoming as cold and hard as the winter ground. "Her name is not Artois, or Valois, or Montclair. She has no lands, no titles, no fortune to offer this kingdom. Nothing but a soul of fire and a will of iron." The shock was so profound it was like a physical blow. The silence was no longer respectful. It was stunned, horrified. Lord Valerius's face had gone pale, his expression a mask of disbelief and fury. The king had just insulted every noble house in the realm in a single breath. "I have made my choice," he finished, his gray eyes seeming to find Alara even in the shadows of her alcove. "The matter is settled." He turned and strode from the hall without another word, leaving a maelstrom of confusion and outrage in his wake. Alara shrank back into the darkness, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. A consort? A soul of fire? He was talking about her. He was talking about a nameless, starving girl who lived in his walls. It was madness. It was a fairy tale turned into a nightmare. He was going to pluck her from her safe obscurity and throw her to the wolves of his court. Later, huddled in the cold darkness behind the throne, she heard his footsteps again. This time, she did not flinch. She waited. He stopped on the other side of the wall, the same spot as before. "They will tear you apart if you stay in the shadows," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Valerius and the others, they will see my declaration as a challenge. They will hunt for this nameless woman. They will not stop until they find you." He was right. She was no longer an anonymous ghost. She was a mystery, a prize, and a threat. Her safe world of walls and passages had just become a trap. "Come out, Alara," he said again. "Stand with me. Let me protect you." "Why?" The word was torn from her, a whisper of pure disbelief. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The iron command was gone, replaced by something raw, something vulnerable. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I looked at someone in this castle and I did not see a lie. I am weary of masks, Alara. I am tired of the poison. When my gaze fell on this wall, I felt something I thought I had lost. A spark of truth." He hesitated. "I will not force you. The choice is yours. You can remain in the walls until they find you, or you can come out and face them, with me at your side." He was offering her a choice between two terrifying futures: to be hunted and destroyed in the dark, or to be hated and reviled in the light. But one of them came with his protection. One of them came with the promise in that strange, warm pull in her chest. For the first time, a flicker of hope ignited within her, a tiny, fragile flame. Hope that she might be more than a survivor, that she might actually live. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed on the loose panel of the screen. It scraped open. She stepped out of the darkness and into the dim moonlight filtering through the throne room's high windows, blinking like a newborn. She stood before her king, a thin, pale girl in a threadbare dress, her hair a mess of tangles, her face smudged with dust. She was nothing, and he looked at her as if she were everything. The weeks that followed were a blur of overwhelming sensations. Alara was moved from the walls to a suite of rooms so lavish they made her ache. She had a bed with silk sheets, a wardrobe of gowns made from velvet and brocade, and more food than she had seen in her entire life. Servants were assigned to her, kind-faced women who taught her the bewildering intricacies of court etiquette. It was a gilded cage, and she felt like an imposter in every moment. The court, predictably, was a viper's nest. Her presentation was a disaster. When King Kale led her into the grand hall, a hush of pure, venomous shock had fallen. They saw a commoner, a street rat elevated far beyond her station. They looked at her with contempt, their whispers following her like a cloud of stinging insects. Gutter snipe, scullery maid, the king's pet mouse. Only the king's presence kept them at bay. He was a shield, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, his storm-gray eyes daring anyone to speak their insults aloud. He spent hours with her, sometimes talking, telling her of the burdens of his crown, the loneliness of his power. More often, they sat in comfortable silence, the strange bond between them a quiet, strengthening hum in the air. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. He was patient, observant, and fiercely protective. He was teaching her that she was not vermin. He was showing her she was worthy of being seen. But Lord Valerius was not so easily silenced. He watched her with a cold, calculating hatred. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle, a low-born usurper who threatened the natural order of things, who threatened his own influence over the king. He was a patient predator, and Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came during the Feast of the First Harvest, the most important state event of the year. Visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms filled the hall, and the air was thick with political tension and forced pleasantries. Alara sat beside Kale at the high table, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that matched the king's tunic. She felt a flicker of confidence, a sense that she might, perhaps, belong here after all. It was a foolish thought. As the main course was being cleared, Lord Valerius rose from his seat, a goblet of wine in his hand. "A toast," he called out, his voice ringing with false cheer. All eyes turned to him. "A toast to our king, and to his surprising choice of companion." The last words were laced with a subtle, cutting disdain. Kale's hand tightened on his own goblet, his knuckles white, but his expression remained impassive. He gave a slight nod, permitting the toast. Valerius smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his handsome face. He turned his gaze directly on Alara. "We are all, of course, captivated by this mysterious woman who has so enchanted our king. This, Alara." He said her name as if it were a piece of filth. "We are told she possesses a soul of fire, a will of iron." Lofty words for one of so humble an origin. The air in the hall grew thick with tension. Ilara's blood ran cold. This was it. "I have, out of concern for His Majesty and the security of the throne, taken the liberty of investigating our guest's past," Valerius continued, his voice dripping with malice. "One must be certain no unfortunate secrets are lurking in the shadows, and what I found was illuminating." He took a deliberate sip of wine, savoring the moment, holding the entire court captive. Ilara felt Kale's hand move to cover hers on the table, a silent offering of strength. She gripped it tightly, her own hand trembling. "It seems our Ilara is not merely a commoner," Valerius announced, his voice rising, projecting to every corner of the room. "Oh no, her blood is far more infamous than that. Tell me, my dear, what was your family name before it was stripped from you? Was it Marwood?" A collective gasp swept through the hall. The name Marwood was poison. It was a name synonymous with treason. Lord and Lady Marwood had been executed 2 years prior for conspiring with the kingdom's enemies, for trying to sell secrets that would have led to a bloody invasion. "She is the daughter of traitors!" Valerius spat, his mask of civility finally falling away to reveal the raw hatred beneath. "The whelp of spies who would have seen us all slaughtered in our beds. This is the soul of fire our king has chosen. A creature born of betrayal and disgrace, whose very presence is a stain upon this court and an insult to the memory of all who died in the wars her parents sought to reignite." The words struck Alara like physical blows. He had found her deepest, most painful secret and had laid it bare for the world to see. The shame she had carried for 2 years, the grief and the horror, washed over her in a suffocating wave. The whispers of the court turned into a roar of outrage and disgust. All the fear and insecurity she had fought so hard to overcome came rushing back. She was not Ilara, the king's chosen. She was Ilara Marwood, the traitor's daughter. She was vermin after all. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She felt Cale's grip tighten, but she could not look at him. She could only stare at Valerius, her heart shattering in her chest. Before the uproar could crest, Cale moved. He did not rise slowly. He was on his feet in a single fluid motion that was shockingly fast. The scraping of his chair was like a thunderclap in the suddenly silent hall. He stepped away from the table and placed himself directly in front of Alara, physically shielding her from the hatred of the crowd and the triumphant sneer of Lord Valerius. His back to her was a wall of solid, unyielding fury. "You are finished, Valerius," Cale said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the tension like a shard of ice. It was a voice that promised death. Valerius seemed to shrink, the bravado draining from his face, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Your Majesty, I only acted in the best interests of the crown. The people have a right to know who they are welcoming into their midst." "You acted in the interests of your own pathetic ambition," Kyle retorted, taking a slow step toward him. The king's rage was a palpable thing now, a cold, dark energy that rolled off him in waves. The entire court, moments ago a baying mob, now cowered in terror. "You speak of her blood. You speak of her parents. You think that matters to me?" He turned his head slightly, his fierce gray eyes finding Alara's. And in them, she saw no judgment, no disappointment. She saw only a raw, blazing protectiveness that stole her breath. "Her parents made their choices and paid their price," he said, his gaze locked with hers. "She is not them. The bond between souls does not care for the sins of the father. It cares for what is. In the heart of this castle, alone, and in the heart of this castle, alone, and with nothing. She endured cold and hunger and fear that would have broken any of you. That is her legacy. Not the name of a father she did not choose, but the strength she forged in the darkness. You call her a stain? You are the rot in this kingdom, Valerius. You and your kind, with your petty cruelties and your obsession with the past." Kyle raised his voice, ensuring every person in the hall heard the final judgment. "I hereby strip you, Valerius, of the House of Artois, of your titles, your lands, and your name. You are an exile. You will leave this city by sunrise. If you are ever seen within the borders of my kingdom again, you will be executed on sight." Valerius fell to his knees, his face ashen with shock and despair. "Your Majesty, please." "Guards," Kyle commanded without looking at him. "Remove this man from my sight." 2 guards seized the former lord by the arms and dragged him, babbling and pleading, from the hall. A profound, terrified silence remained. Kyle turned back to Ilara. The cold fury in his eyes softened as he looked at her, replaced by a fierce, undeniable emotion. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking away a single tear that had escaped her control. "You are everything," he whispered, a vow meant only for her. And then, in front of the silent, watching court and the stunned foreign dignitaries, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a claiming. It was fierce and passionate and absolute, a kiss that sealed their bond and declared her his, now and forever. It was a king choosing his queen, not for her bloodline, but for her soul. In that moment, surrounded by enemies, Alara felt safer and more loved than she had ever felt in her life. She was no longer hiding. She was home. 3 months later, Alara woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering into the royal chambers. The scent of winter jasmine from the gardens below drifted through the open balcony doors. She was wrapped in the warmth of linen sheets and the stronger, more solid warmth of the man sleeping beside her. Kale's arm was draped protectively over her waist, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against her back. She turned carefully in his arms to look at him. In sleep, the hard lines of his face were softened. The weight of the crown was temporarily lifted, revealing the man beneath. The man who had found her in the dark and had shown her the sun. The fierce, lonely king who had found his match in a girl who lived in his walls. A tender smile touched her lips. This quiet, domestic peace was a miracle she still had trouble believing was real. Her new life was not just about comfort and safety. It was about purpose. With Kale's full support and the endless resources of the crown, she had thrown herself into a project born from her own suffering. She had established a series of orphanages and shelters throughout the city, ensuring that no child would ever have to face the cold, hungry desperation she had known. She had traded her passages and crawl spaces for a seat on the small council, where her practical, hard-won knowledge of the common people's struggles had become an invaluable asset. The courtiers, who had once sneered at her, now treated her with a grudging respect. They called her the Queen of the Shadows, a title that was half mockery, half awe. She had taken the darkness of her past and turned it into a source of light for others. Kale stirred, his gray eyes opening. They were no longer stormy and weary. They were clear and calm, and they lit up when they saw her. He pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a soft, sleepy kiss. "Good morning, my queen," he murmured against her mouth. "Good morning, my king," she whispered back, tracing the line of his jaw with her finger. "You have a meeting with the trade emissaries today." He groaned, burying his face in her hair. "Must I? Can we not simply declare the day a holiday and remain here?" She laughed, a sound that was still new and wonderful to her. "You can't. You have a kingdom to run, and I have to inspect the new kitchens at the Northgate shelter. They're finally finished." He pulled back, his expression serious, though his eyes danced with affection. "You work too hard. You have transformed this city in 3 months, Alara. In me when I was nothing but dust, and in me when I was nothing but dust and desperation." "I saw everything," he corrected her gently. "I just had to convince you to see it too." He paused, his gaze growing distant for a moment, as if looking back in time. "Do you ever miss it? The silence? The solitude?" Alara thought of the cold stone, the gnawing hunger, the constant creeping fear. But she also remembered the perfect, unbroken silence, the feeling of being completely unseen, utterly free from judgment. "Sometimes I miss the quiet," she admitted honestly. "But I would not trade this for anything. I was surviving then. Now, I am living." He kissed her again, a deep, lingering kiss full of shared memories and future promises. "I am glad you stepped out from behind the throne, Alara Marwood." She smiled against his lips. "I am glad you were there to find me, Kale." They had found each other in the space between a throne and a wall, a king weary of lies, and a girl who was nothing but truth. He had saved her from the shadows, and she, in turn, had saved him from the crushing loneliness of his crown. Together, they were more than a king and his consort. They were two halves of a single soul, finally made whole. And their reign, born of resilience and forged in love, was just beginning.